There we go. They're all yours.
Okay. Well, and we'll keep doing like we have been doing, which is if anyone has any questions or thoughts, please interrupt me because I want you to. And Jimmy, if you'll help in that regard, if you see anybody waving their hand or doing the little Zoom raising your hand command, that will help me, and just interrupt and jump in. So, well, this is our third session. I'm so grateful you all are tuning in, and I hope this has been meaningful for all of you. This session, we're going to be looking at the story of the exile, which is not one story, but a whole lot of stories of when the nation of Israel was conquered by foreign empires and destroyed, and its rulers and leaders and elites were taken into captivity in Babylon. But before we jump into that, there was a question at the very end of last session about Elijah, when we were talking about Elijah. And the question was, why was Elijah present with Moses when Jesus was transfigured in the Gospels? And so I wanted just to return to that. And the short answer for that is, in Judaism, Moses was understood as the lawgiver of the Torah, and was understood as in many ways embodying or symbolic of the law, the Torah. And Elijah in this case is representing all of the prophets. A number of times in the Gospels, Jesus refers to the law and the prophets testifying to him. And so Moses and Elijah showing up at the Transfiguration, where Jesus's real divinity is made manifest, is symbolic of Jewish tradition of the law and the prophets being fulfilled. And then another interpretation I've heard is that Moses and Elijah both have sort of strange stories associated with them about their death. Elijah in the book of 2 Kings doesn't actually die. He is taken up to heaven in a chariot, a heavenly fiery chariot. That's where we get the
way to go.
That's where we get the gospel tune, swing low, sweet chariot. And so Elijah doesn't actually die. And in Moses's case, the book of Deuteronomy actually says Moses dies at 120 years old. But there's, in Jewish tradition, that never makes it in the Bible, there are stories of Moses not actually dying, but like Elijah, being taken up to heaven instead of dying. And so the thought is that these two big figures in Jewish history never died, but were taken to heaven. And so they can sort of go back down whenever, God needs to send them on a mission from heaven. And so those are the two major reasons why Elijah was present, was because of his strange death, and also he symbolizes all of the prophets pointing towards Jesus. So hope that's helpful to the folks who asked it last week. So, all right, well, this session, we're going to be talking about, like I said, the exile. And when this happens in around the late 500s BC. And this is a time when all of Israel's aspirations of being their own nation, of having a king and a beautiful capital city, all come to ruin. And so what happens after that point is the Jewish people have to begin to rewrite their story. Since their existence no longer was going the way they had planned or believed or expected it would be, at this point, what happens is the Jewish religion goes through an overhaul in terms of how they reflect upon their history, how they understand their story, and what they begin saying about themselves. And they end up writing a new story and having a new understanding of themselves. And that new story and new understanding of who they are enables them to go forward in their lives and as a community. And it's arguable that without this traumatic event, this terrible event in their history, and if they hadn't evolved and changed and come up with a new story, that the Jewish people might not have survived all that would happen to them in the centuries to come, and some might say even in the 2,500 years since. And so where this comes for us in our journey is thinking about times in our life where we have ended up in the wilderness, which we're describing as a time when our life ends up going through a difficult time where things are not turning out the way we expected. The normal way of surviving, of being, isn't working anymore. The things that we depend upon to make sense of our lives and the world around us don't work anymore. And we can't make sense of our experience. That when those times happen, a part of going forward, a part of healing, a part of changing is rewriting our own story, our understanding of who we are, our understanding of where we've been and why we've been there, and our understanding of who we will be going forward. These big, difficult, troubling events in our lives, in order for us to move past them and move on and heal from them, involve us changing the story that we tell about ourselves. And so what this means is when we experience a divorce and the end of a marriage or a relationship, we have to learn to accept that our old story of us continuing on in our lives with this person is at an end. And we are no longer the person who was married or in that relationship. We are a person now who is divorced or with the relationship ended, and we have to tell a new story. Or when we have experienced a grief of a significant relationship in our lives, parents, siblings, children, friends, and we had expected that relationship to go on into the future, but it ends, and we experience that grief and pain. We are no longer the person who is going to continue on with this loved one in our lives in the same way. Instead, we become a different person who has experienced this grief and loss, and we have to tell a different story about who we are in order to go forward. And the same thing happens when we experience a job loss or the end of a career. When we retire, even, can be a really difficult experience because we were a person on a certain trajectory with our career and our identity and our sense of self-worth. And now we have to come up with a new story of who are we now that ended and life isn't turning out like we thought it would, or we're moving into retirement. And we were a person who did this kind of work. And now we are a person who does something different. And, you know, there can be other traumatic events and disruptions in our lives that occur. Abuse, getting sober and entering into recovery. You know, there are a lot of these disruptions and wilderness moments that come that invite us to tell a new story. And so I'm going to read you a few quotes about our self stories. And I'd like you to be thinking of maybe times in your lives where you have had an experience where you had to come to grips with your life is no longer unfolding the way you expected it to or thought it would, and you had to come up with a new story of who you are and where you're going. But in terms of story making, the most helpful writing that I've come across is by the author and researcher Brene Brown. She's become very popular in recent years. She's a social scientist who does a lot of research about why people behave the way they do. And she has a wonderful knack of writing and speaking about that research in a very accessible way that non-academic people like me can understand. And she's written some wonderful books, and she has a podcast and TED Talks, and you can find her out there on the internet if you're not familiar with her already. But she writes this about our stories. She says, owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy, the experiences that make us the most vulnerable. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. And she's also written a lot about shame. And she has some of the most helpful distinctions about shame and guilt I've ever come across. She describes guilt as something that everyone should feel if you're not a psychopath or a narcissist, that we do things that are wrong, that hurt other people. We accept responsibility for our bad actions, and we do our best to make amends for them and learn from them and not repeat them. That's different from shame. Shame is that feeling we get that says because we made these bad actions or hurtful actions, that we are therefore a terrible person, unusually terrible, worse than others, and that we will never get better. Shame makes a judgment about who we are and what our worth is. Guilt is actually a healthy thing where we take responsibility for bad actions and do our best to make up for them. Shame wants us to stay there feeling terrible about ourselves, and it is one of the key things that keeps us from moving on, being a healthier person, and healing. And she says, shame hates it when we reach out and tell our story. Shame hates having words wrapped around it. Shame can't survive being shared. Shame loves secrecy. When we bury our story, the shame metastasizes as if it's cancer. And she says shame derives its power over us by being unspeakable. And shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change. And so a part of what ancient Israel had to deal with was its own shame over its mistakes and moving to the point of admitting guilt and seeking to do better. And what prevents us from writing new stories about ourselves and healing and getting better is shame, which wants us to not talk about the pain we've gone through, wants us to not share it with others, wants us to not be vulnerable and just stew in our own juices. And it's a very destructive force in our lives. Telling our stories, rewriting our stories. This is why we have support groups. It's why we have recovery and 12-step groups. It's why we should have groups in our churches, but often don't, where people can trust one another, be vulnerable with one another, and share their stories with one another. And so I'm wondering, is there anybody who's brave enough to speak up and maybe share a point where your life changed and the story you had been living with about yourself had to change in order for you to heal and grow? Does anybody have an experience like that in their life?
Do you want me to raise my hand?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, hi. I was eating lunch. That's why I went off camera.
Okay.
As you were talking, I realized that aging is one of those things.
Oh, yeah.
And every day, as I lose something that I used to have, or I can't do something I used to do, it's a loss that is very hard to talk about, particularly with grown children, sometimes with spouse. And I think it's needing to change the story is a little tricky, because the less you can do and the more you're restricted by the aging process or health issues, whatever, the harder it is to change the story.
Mm-hmm. And let me press you on that and say, what's the alternative to changing the story? And what's the cost of not changing your story?
Well, others might have something to say about that. I'm not
Okay.
sure. I'm in process on this.
Okay. Well, I'm
in process. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, we lost your audio.
Oh,
Now okay, there we go. You did hear then.
Okay. Well, I would say that I'm only middle-aged, but I'm already adjusting to changing my story in terms of my life not turning out like I thought it would. And and I would say the cost seems to always be, I don't know anything about, ask me in 20 years, 30 years, and I might have a different answer. And maybe I might say everything I'm saying now is bogus, but the cost, I think, of us not changing our stories is always we stall out and miss out on joy of what we still are able to do. And we miss out on possibilities. For me at middle age, with my issues are ones of career and vocation and changing the language I've used, instead of saying I haven't achieved what I thought I would have achieved by now. So the language I have used is that would make me a failure. And I'm having to learn new language that says, no, I'm not a failure. My life is just different. And therefore I need to figure out and redefine what success actually means and achievement actually means, and so forth. And continuing to deny changing that story stalls me out in terms of feeling like I'm not a person of worth. I am a person who's failed. I'm, you know, I follow the road of depression if I go that way. Does anybody else have maybe other stories? I think aging is an excellent example because it is a series of losses. Anyone else want to share?
Yeah, Chase, I would go through the same process as you go through from spouse to parent to grandparent. You know, when you've got the young kids, you tend to be more directive. You know, you're not going to touch the stove because you're going to burn yourself. When there's a teenager, you almost encourage them to touch the stove just to teach them the damn lesson. And then, you know, when you're the grandparent, but still, you know, your kids you have, you almost got to go back almost into a counseling where you almost don't give advice unless you're asked. You know, you're evolving. Are you the same person? I don't know. You're learning, but it's a sphere that rolls. And you know, we've had discussions with other people with their kids that are having difficulties, and you know, it's a tightrope you walk. And you have to go through that. And sometimes it's very painful because you know the mistake is coming and you see it and you got to step back and just let it happen. And the words "I told you so" are buried deep in the canyons. But then you have this guilt that you let them fail, but sometimes, you know, they have to. But it's an evolution of parenthood, of grandparenthood. And it's nice being the grandparent where you can come in for a week, spoil and destroy the house, and then get out of it and let the ruin stay. But I'm sure other people have that experience of, you know, from the directorship to taking the step back, and now, you know, just being the counselor. But it involves all those emotions, like you said, of guilt, of learning, I don't know if it's redefining yourself, but seeing how things work with that evolution of kids and grandkids.
Yeah, that's an excellent example. And what I've observed, I haven't experienced it yet because my kids are teenagers, but what I've observed is from watching grandparents is that there's some wisdom that comes with knowing, I don't know, as a parent, you're so panicked and there's anxiety of, am I doing this wrong, you know, with your kids? And then you get to be grandparents and you kind of loosen up and understand that maybe you had less control or power over your kids than you thought you did. And hopefully they turned out okay anyway. And I hopefully, you know, there's a change in story in terms of, you know, if we've told ourselves narratives of we're failures or we screwed up our kids, we begin to learn, oh, you know, they were their own people, and they made choices that were beyond our control. And I think part of relaxing into the grandparent role, for what I've observed, is accepting, you know, and relaxing, because you don't feel this pressure that, you know, you feel when you're the parent all the time. I don't know. I sense from watching my kids' grandparents and watching other people who are grandparenting is grandparents tend to offer a lot more grace to their grandchildren and a lot more grace to themselves. I suppose they could also be judgmental of their kids' parenting too, but hopefully it's grace. So, does anybody else have any of these? Are great examples. Any other stories along your life's journeys?
Well, grandchildren are a blessing.
Say that again, Maria.
Grandchildren are a total blessing. And I learned not to be judgmental and love them through all their faults and their flaws and forgive them, but really forgive them and try to understand them. And then everything is kind of good.
Yeah. Well, and was it easier for you as a grandparent to do that than as a parent?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
That's right. That's right. So, well, these are good examples. Well, all right. Let's go back to the experience of Israel. I want to give you a brief history lesson. In the study guide, I'll send out all the dates and country names will be in that. So if you don't follow the dates right now, don't worry about it. But a big part of the experience of ancient Israel was its geographic location. If you can think about in your mind a map of the modern Middle East, where the modern state of Israel is, it's on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and below it to the south is Egypt, and then to the north is modern day Lebanon and Syria, and going over to the east, modern day Iraq. And so Israel, because of its location, was always being endangered by whoever the biggest kid on the block was. Israel was a smaller nation, and it had a few hundred years of good years, but that was only when another great power nearby didn't try to invade and conquer them. Either Egypt or then it was the Assyrian Empire in modern day Lebanon and Syria, and then the Babylonian Empire, and then the Persian Empire, and then the Greek Empire. And we're dealing with the part of time where after the glory days of King David and King Solomon, Israel actually splits into two nations. And the northern kingdom is called Israel, and it is destroyed in the 700s BC, before Christ. And the southern kingdom makes it for about 150 more years before it gets destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. And these events, understandably, are very traumatic to the people of Israel. And they're in a position in terms of the story they have told themselves, which is the story as they have understood it, is that they were God's chosen people, that God would make them a great nation, but it hasn't turned out that way. Instead, they have been destroyed and conquered, and their best and brightest have been carried away into captivity, hundreds, maybe 1,000 miles away. And so the question is, does that mean God isn't great? Does that mean they did something wrong? Does it mean the gods of Babylon and Assyria and Egypt are better gods than their God? How do they make sense of it, and how do they go on? And they were operating like a nation, like the other nations, with a king and a capital city and a big temple to their God, and all that gets taken away. And they have to understand what happened. And who am I now? And as I said earlier, this manifests in a transformation of their religion and their self-identity. And what we could understand the story is if we were looking at it from a secular history, we might say Israel was always doomed. It was always a small country next to big empires, and was always going to be taken over. But Israel chooses to understand it as something different, that their God is still the most powerful God, but God allowed this destruction to happen to them. And so they begin to understand it as judgment from God, because they broke the covenant with God, or they allowed the worship in the temple of God to become corrupt. And that raises a theological question, which is, why do bad things happen to us? And there certainly are a lot of different answers in the Bible. I always say to students, and when I'm talking about the Bible, is that the Bible is not one book. It shows up for us in the modern world in the form of one book. But it actually was 66 different books, most of which went through dramatic amounts of editing and changing over centuries. And so that means there are at least 66 different theological points of view. And sometimes within particular books, you can see evidence of editing over time, over centuries. And so you might have multiple theological points of view in one book. And so one explanation for the bad things that happens to Israel is that God is still God, but God punishes Israel through these other empires that come and conquer them. Now, as a pastor and a minister, I don't subscribe to that theological understanding, because I think of all the rotten people in the world who do terrible things, whom seem to get away with it in this life. Why is it that the major criminals of the world aren't immediately struck by lightning? Or why is it that someone who does terrible things isn't immediately punished? So I reason that if God did work that way, then a whole lot of people who would deserve to get zapped, that should be in the front of the line, aren't getting zapped. And so when I talk with people who feel like they're being punished by God, I don't necessarily try to talk them out of it. I just try to present a different point of view. How I understand God's judgment is much more in terms of what we find in other parts of the Bible, especially in the first chapter of Romans, where Paul describes the wrath of God as not being God sending a natural disaster on us, but rather God giving us the freedom of choice and allowing us to make bad choices and live with the consequences. And that the consequences of our destructive or harmful choices are their own form of punishment that actually God might use. God didn't cause, but God might use in order to help change us and help us to grow. And so when we talk about wilderness moments, or these moments in our lives where we experience loss and grief and have to reorient ourselves and rewrite our stories that we tell about ourselves and what our life will be, I don't find it helpful to think that describe it as God punishing us. I believe that there are natural forces that operate in the world, and then there's human greed and sin and control and violence, and that we are a part of that. And it's our job to try to make sense of it and find healing. And that's the part of the process where God comes in. And so I want to take Israel's experience, and I don't want to go along with their understanding of judgment, but I do want to point out that in the Hebrew prophets, especially the prophets of Jeremiah and Elijah, who were writing at this time, they point out things that Israel was doing that brought on their own destruction. That Israel had become greedy and corrupt in terms of the people who had the most money and power were oppressing the majority of the people who didn't have money or power or land, that they were worshiping other gods besides Yahweh, that they were trying to be like every other country and adopting values and ethics that were not the values and ethics of God and God's covenant. And they were doing real harm to one another through their greed and corruption, and not living and being who they were created to be in the first place. And what I would want to offer is the lesson for us is that on our journeys, when we experience difficulty, that a part of what we have to do is learn from what's happened to us, learn from our mistakes, learn from the harm maybe other people have caused to us, learn from the grief and the loss, and that if we allow God to work through us to help us change, to write new stories, then we find meaning and value in our pain and our suffering. It's not to say that we want to simplify it and say that God caused our pain so that we might grow and change. I don't believe that, but rather the pain and the suffering is a mystery. And we have the job of making meaning about it, making sense of it, learning from it, changing and growing. And the goal of all of this is to become whom we were created to be. And the language I'm going to use is to say, this is the language of discovering your true self, who you truly are, and who you were truly created to be by God. And I want to make a book recommendation for you. This is one of my favorite books that I have recommended to numerous people in their lives, as especially people struggling with vocation and work, but it's really useful for anyone dealing with a life change. And it's a short book, it's pretty thin. You could read it in an afternoon, although I think each chapter, I needed to read it. The chapter I could read in about 20 minutes, and then I needed hours to reflect upon the chapter. It's called Let Your Life Speak, Listening to the Voice of Vocation. And it is by a man named Parker Palmer. And he's become one of the most important writers for me in terms of trying to work through my own issues of identity, of who am I, who did God create me to be, and how have I been living and contrary to that. And he's a Quaker by religion. And so he sort of adopts the Quaker understanding of each of us being made in the image of God, as Genesis says, and that inside of each of us was God's fingerprint, so to speak, or sometimes the language is an inner light or a true light, your true self inside of you that, due to growing up and cultural conditioning and family of origin and our experiences and our pain we haven't dealt with, that we cover up that true self with layers, and we wear masks to hide that true self, and we become other people than who we really are on the inside, and we're made to be all along. And what I see in Israel's experience of exile is that they were created to be one thing. They chose to become something else. And the trauma and the difficulties of exile helped them to recover their true self, who they were created to be all along. That they weren't created to be a nation with a king like every other nation. They were created not to be like the other countries around them. They were created to be something unique. And in the same way, we hope for our children and our grandchildren to become who they really are and not adopt, going along with the crowd or becoming like other people or giving into peer pressure or pursuing a job or a career or a life that is somehow not a good fit for themselves. That we also want that for ourselves, that we are who we were truly meant to be. And so I'm going to read you a few quotes from Parker Palmer. He says that the true self, when violated, will always resist us, sometimes at great cost, holding our lives in check until we honor its truth. In other words, when we're living in a way that's contrary to who we were created to be, that's where we experience burnout, depression, living with anxiety. That's where we come with disillusionment and despair. And when we aren't living being who we were really created to be, we can actually cause damage in our relationships, in our jobs, in our families, in our marriages, because the inner misery we have, we end up overflowing and transmitting that unhappiness and misery to other people. And he writes this rather long quote. He says, "What a long time it can take to become the person one has always been. How often in the process we mask ourselves in faces that are not our own. How much dissolving and shaking of ego we must endure before we discover our deep identity, the true self within every human being." And he tells a Jewish story that illustrates the point. He says, "There is a Hasidic tale that reveals with amazing brevity both the universal tendency to want to be someone else and the ultimate importance of becoming oneself. Rabbi Zusha, when he was an old man, said, 'In the coming world, they will not ask me, why were you not Moses? They will ask me, why were you not Zusha?' Our deepest calling is to grow into our own authentic selfhood, whether or not it conforms into some image of who we ought to be. As we do so, we will not only find the joy that every human being seeks, we will also find our path of authentic service in the world." And he says, the poet Rumi says, "If you are here unfaithfully with us, you're causing terrible damage. So if we are unfaithful to our true self, we will extract a price from others. We will make promises we cannot keep, build houses from flimsy stuff, conjure dreams that devolve into nightmares, and other people will suffer if we are not faithful to our true self." And so I'm going to read to you from the prophet Jeremiah, who writes of Israel's time. And Jeremiah describes Israel this way: "For from the least to the greatest of them, everyone is greedy for unjust gain. And from prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace. They acted shamefully and committed abomination. They were not ashamed, for they did not know how to blush." And so that image of not being able to blush, to realize their own problems, their own faults. And so when I talk with people who are in recovery and are sober, or if you've ever known someone who had an addiction, that they talk about hitting bottom, a moment where They had to deal with the truth of where their addiction had taken them, when they let go of the excuses, or when they had to finally admit that they were helpless over their addiction. And at that point, they could let go of the lies. They could learn how to blush. They could learn to accept responsibility. And so much harm happens in life from people who refuse to accept responsibility for their own actions. And I bet all of us could name people, or might name moments where we refused to take responsibility, and it was a growth process for us to admit our mistakes, or maybe the harm we've had in a relationship with someone who could not accept responsibility for their harmful actions. And so what our moments of wilderness, our moments of struggle cause us to do is to sort of strip away our ego until we're bound down to the bare bones of who we really are, where we drop the excuses, we drop the lies, we drop the falsehoods, the illusions we've been living with. And, you know, we come down to the brass tacks of who we are and where our life is, and rewrite that story and begin on a different trajectory of becoming someone different under the circumstances and changing. And that's where the healing begins. And that's where I think the wisdom begins too, that we have to share. I'm going to pause there because I've been talking a lot and we're closing in on our time. I'll just say, I'd like to hear any feedback you've got. I'll just say that what Israel ends up doing is changing. And the prophet Jeremiah says that God will make a new covenant with them, not a covenant they have to learn from the outside, but a covenant that will be written on their hearts, that they will know and they will live out through their actions. And it speaks of kind of a growth of wholeness, of change, until our self becomes integrated and we let go of this false self and we become who we were always meant to be. And we lead healthier lives, more whole lives. This is the gift of these difficult moments in our journeys. What they can give us is that we can become more whole people, healthier people, people of integrity, rather than people who refuse to take responsibility for our own lives. I'd like to open it up. If there are any, in the few minutes we have left, is there any reaction or questions to what I've been laying out there?
Great.
Chase, I would comment that, you know, in Israel, in exile, etc., even when David was in his dire moments, the one thing he said, you know, in the Psalms that really struck me was when he said to God, "Do not turn your face away from me."
Mm-hmm.
And I've had some people, when they said, you know, "Look, how can you describe hell?" They would say hell is the absence of God.
Mm-hmm.
And they would figure that when they hit those wilderness moments, between all the other fears they had, the biggest fear was that God had left them. And they needed the ability to get back that faith and rebuild that. And maybe that was a rebuilding of their self, but that was that was their darkest moment of hitting bottom, when they felt God had abandoned them.
Yeah. And I ran out of time in this session. I probably bit off more than I could chew. And maybe I'll fit it into the next one. But along with the Psalms that you mentioned and the prophets, there's something called lament or lamentation, which is an honest crying out to God in our pain. And a necessary part of healing and dealing with our grief is honesty. You know, if you've ever been in therapy, a lot of what therapy is designed to do is to help us be honest with ourselves. And the Bible equips us to be able to do that and, you know, and deal with that feeling of God's absence. Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's in the Bible, and there's all these Psalms that describe, this brutal honesty of God, where are you? Why did you let this happen to me? And that a necessary part of our growth before we can get to faith again and believing in God's presence is that honest crying out of pain. And unfortunately, a lot of religion doesn't allow for that honesty. Thank you for that. I'll try to come back to that next time. Somebody else? I'm interested if the description of the idea of returning to your true self makes any sense. One of the things I've heard written about it is if we're fortunate enough to live long enough, we spend the first half of our life putting on all the masks and the false things and trying to be someone we're not. And the second half of life is taking all that off and being wise enough and secure enough to become who we always truly were in the first place. So some of you who are older than me and have more wisdom, I'd love to know if you've experienced some of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Maria, what did that look like for you?
Well, I finally learned to be my own self and not to try to be somebody that I'm really not, just to fit in and to belong. It's really not that important anymore when you're older.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of nice to be, it's not fun to be 90, no. But I wish I were younger and knew then what I know now.
Right. And maybe we're just not capable, So I couldn't read the comment that just came up. Will somebody read it for me? Jimmy, did you see that comment?
It was me.
Oh.
I
Okay.
just wanted to say my only regret is that I've missed the 2 prior sessions. I really appreciated your insights today. They were very, very helpful in many ways. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I hope you've gotten to take care of the study guide, take a look at the study guides, and you can even watch the Zooms of the previous sessions. So,
Yeah, the first 2 are on the church's YouTube page.
Yeah, I intend to watch them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He gets a little worse every week, but those first couple of ones were really good.
yeah, I'm definitely, there's a diminishing return the longer you're around with me, I think. So, very impressive at first and then, discipline. So, all right.
And remember, Chase is going to be here with his very tall son. He's going to be preaching on Palm Sunday. And then the last of the Lenten series, that Wednesday, the Wednesday of Holy Week, will be both in person and online. So Chase will be here in the flesh to do his last session. And then we will certainly put it on Zoom for everybody who needs to do it that way. So
Great.
There's a lot more Chase to come.
Yeah. Well, next week, we're going to zoom ahead a few hundred years to the Apostle Paul's thorn in the flesh, where he talks about praying for God to take away whatever this thorn in the flesh is. And God says no, and instead says, my strength is revealed in weakness. And I'll also talk some more about the idea of lamentation as necessary for healing and spiritual growth. And then we'll get to Jesus, and we'll have the session on Jesus's temptation in the wilderness. And then in Holy Week, when we're together in person, we're going to talk about Jesus's last days and his experience of abandonment, and talk about what resurrection means. All right. Thank you all so much for being a part of this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chase.
It's great to see your faces.